really wrote the Gospels? For nearly 2,000 years, Christians have been told that the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written by men who either walked with Jesus or had direct access to those who did. This claim is repeated from the pulpit, reinforced in Sunday school, and taken as an unquestionable fact. But is it actually true? Or is it just another layer of myth built to prop up a religion that depends on blind faith rather than real evidence? The traditional claim goes like this. Matthew, one of Jesus' 12 disciples, supposedly wrote the gospel bearing his name, giving us a first-hand account of the Messiah's teachings. Mark, we're told, was a companion of Peter, meaning his gospel comes straight from the words of Jesus' closest follower. Luke, allegedly a companion of Paul, is credited with writing not only the Gospel of Luke but also the book of Acts, making him a supposed historian of early Christianity. John, the so-called beloved disciple, is said to have penned the final gospel, providing an intimate and deeply spiritual portrayal of Jesus. It sounds convincing, right? The perfect lineup, disciples and direct witnesses, writing down exactly what happened. But here's the problem. None of it holds up under scrutiny. For starters, nowhere in the actual text of these Gospels do the authors claim to be who tradition says they are. Not once does Matthew say, "I, Matthew, saw this happen." Mark never introduces himself. Luke doesn't sign his name at the bottom. John never even hints that he's the one writing. These books were completely anonymous when they were first written. The names? They were slapped on later, long after the fact, by church leaders desperate to give them credibility. And let's think about this logically. How would these supposed eyewitnesses have even written these texts? The disciples were uneducated, lower-class Aramaic-speaking Jews. But these Gospels? They're written in sophisticated Greek, filled with literary devices, theological arguments, and references to the Old Testament in its Greek translation, not the Hebrew one. In other words, they weren't written by uneducated fishermen from Galilee. They were written by educated, Greek-speaking Christians, people far removed from the events they were describing. So if these weren't eyewitness accounts, what were they? The answer is simple. They were stories, legends, and theological propaganda written decades after the fact by anonymous authors who had an agenda. The idea that they were penned by actual disciples is nothing more than a fabrication, a lie meant to make these books appear more authoritative than they really are. And that's just the beginning. Once we start pulling on this thread, the entire narrative of divine inspiration and biblical truth starts to unravel. If the Gospels aren't what Christians claim they are, then what else about their religion is built on a lie? Part 1. Who actually wrote the Gospels? The truth Christianity doesn't want you to know. For nearly 2,000 years, Christians have been fed the lie that the four Gospels were written by direct eyewitnesses or their close associates. But when we actually examine the historical evidence, that claim collapses under its own weight. The reality? The Gospels were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They were written by anonymous, educated, Greek-speaking Christians, decades after the supposed events, and nowhere near the lands of Jesus and his disciples. Even conservative scholars now admit this. Bart Ehrman, a leading biblical historian, states bluntly, the disciples of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking peasants from Galilee. The Gospels, on the other hand, were written in Greek by highly educated authors who were skilled in literary composition. So let's break this down. Who actually wrote these books? Let's look at them one by one. Mark, the first Gospel, not written by a disciple. Christian tradition claims Mark was written by John Mark, a companion of Peter. But here's the problem. Nowhere in the Gospel does the author claim this. That connection was made decades later by early church fathers, desperate to attach an apostolic name to an anonymous book. Most scholars believe Mark was written in Rome, not in Palestine, and not by an eyewitness. The text itself suggests that the author didn't even know basic Jewish customs. He misinterprets Jewish laws, Mark 7:3-4, and geography, Mark 5:1, Mark 7:31. This makes one thing clear. Mark wasn't a Jew from Galilee. He was a Greek-speaking Christian, likely living in Rome, writing for a Gentile audience. New Testament scholar Richard Carrier notes, the Gospel of Mark reads like a story written by someone constructing a theological narrative, not an eyewitness recording history. on the historicity of Jesus 2014. And let's not forget, Mark is riddled with errors, contradictions, and borrowed mythology. This was never meant to be history. It was a religious drama, written decades after Jesus' supposed death. Matthew copying from Mark and Q, adding fiction. Matthew is often portrayed as the most Jewish gospel, supposedly written by Matthew the tax collector, a disciple of Jesus. But let's get real. The author of Matthew was not Matthew the disciple. In fact, he copied over 90% of Mark's gospel, nearly word for word. Let's think about that. If Matthew was really an eyewitness, why would he rely so heavily on Mark, who wasn't? Wouldn't an actual disciple have his own first-hand memories to write from? This alone exposes the fraud. But it doesn't stop there. Matthew not only plagiarized Mark, he also pulled from another mysterious source that scholars call the Q source, short for Quell, meaning source in German. Q is a hypothetical collection of Jesus' sayings that Matthew and Luke both seem to have drawn from. Since much of the material shared by Matthew and Luke is absent from Mark, scholars conclude they must have had a separate written source, which likely consisted of sayings and teachings attributed to Jesus rather than narratives about his life. This means that Matthew wasn't writing history. He was compiling, editing, and embellishing an existing mix of earlier sources to shape a theological narrative that suited his agenda. Matthew expands on Mark by adding key theological elements that aren't found in the earliest gospel, such as the virgin birth, nowhere in Mark but essential for tying Jesus to messianic prophecy. The genealogy of Jesus, a fabricated lineage designed to link Jesus to David and Abraham. The Sermon on the Mount, a collection of teachings drawn largely from Q. The resurrection appearances, completely absent from early versions of Mark, but inserted here to reinforce the divine narrative. As Bible scholar Raymond Brown bluntly states, Matthew is a revision and expansion of Mark. Its author is unknown and certainly not an eyewitness. An Introduction to the New Testament, 1997. And leading New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman explains, Matthew and Luke not only copied Mark, but also relied on a now-lost document called Q. Neither of them were eyewitnesses. They were compilers, shaping existing traditions into a theological narrative. Jesus Interrupted, 2009. This all leads to one conclusion. The Gospel of Matthew is not a first-hand account. It's a carefully constructed theological rewrite, borrowing from multiple sources and packed with later inventions. In other words, it's religious propaganda, not history. Luke, the Gospel of Paul's followers, not Jesus' own. The Gospel of Luke is claimed to be written by Luke, the physician, a companion of Paul. But once again, the text itself never claims this. Church tradition assigned Luke's name over a century after the book was written, just like it did with the other Gospels. And just like Matthew, Luke is not an independent source. It copies over 50% of Mark and likely drew from the Q source, the lost collection of Jesus' sayings that also influenced Matthew. But beyond that, Luke rewrites the story to fit a very different theological agenda. Luke presents a version of Jesus tailored to match Paul's vision of Christianity, rather than anything Jesus himself may have actually taught. That's no accident. This gospel was crafted to appeal to a Gentile audience, not Jewish followers of Jesus. The result? A Roman-friendly, sanitized version of Jesus that downplays his Jewish roots and transforms him into a universal savior figure. Famed biblical scholar Joseph Fitzmyer acknowledges, the author of Luke is an educated Greek writer, not a Palestinian eyewitness. The Gospel according to Luke, 1981. Luke contradicts Matthew's birth story, invents historical details that don't line up with known facts, and conveniently molds Jesus' teachings to align with Paul's doctrines. The author was no companion of Paul. He was a later Christian rewriting history to push his own theological vision. John, the most fabricated gospel of all. John is where Christianity goes completely off the rails. This gospel is the most mystical, the most theological, and the least historical. The Jesus in John is not the same as the Jesus in the other gospels. In John, Jesus isn't just a teacher or a prophet, he's practically a cosmic deity. But here's the kicker. John was not written by the disciple John. Scholars overwhelmingly agree that John's Gospel was written by a group of Christians in the late 1st century, long after John was supposedly dead. The The book has multiple layers, contradictions, and theological insertions, showing it went through numerous revisions over time. Bart Ehrman explains, "The Gospel of John was written by a community of Christians who already believed in Jesus' divinity, and it reflects their theological agenda rather than historical events. How Jesus Became God, 2014. John even contradicts the earlier Gospels on key details. Jesus' crucifixion date. John moves it to a different day to make Jesus fit Jewish symbolism. Jesus' teachings. John's Jesus gives long theological speeches completely absent from the other Gospels. The nature of Jesus. Mark presents Jesus as more human. John makes him a walking God. This Gospel wasn't written by an eyewitness. It was written by a theological cult reshaping Jesus into something he never was." Part 2. The Synoptic Problem. The so-called synoptic problem isn't just some academic puzzle. It's a glaring indictment of the Gospel authors as copyists, not eyewitnesses. It exposes the fact that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were not three independent accounts, but rather textually dependent on each other, or on earlier, now-lost sources. Think about this. If these were truly first-hand reports of Jesus' life from different individuals, why do they line up almost verbatim in so many places? The word-for-word parallels, the identical phrasing, even the exact same mistakes. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence of literary dependence, meaning one gospel is lifting text from another rather than reporting an original account. Scholars overwhelmingly agree that Mark was written first, with Matthew and Luke blatantly copying large portions of it, sometimes over 90% in Matthew's case and over 50% in Luke's. And yet these two Gospels don't just copy Mark. They edit it, alter it, add new material, and tweak theology to fit their own narratives. This isn't divine inspiration, it's deliberate revisionism. The so-called Q source is another piece of the puzzle. A hypothetical lost document that Matthew and Luke appear to have both drawn from, in addition to copying Mark. But we don't even need Q to prove the fraud. The direct copying from Mark alone obliterates the idea of these Gospels being independent eyewitness testimony. The bottom line? The synoptic problem is really the synoptic scandal. The Gospel writers were not divinely inspired biographers. They were later Christian authors crafting a theological story, borrowing, editing, and rewriting to fit their own agendas. The so-called synoptic problem isn't just a matter of scholarly debate. It's a damning indictment of gospel authorship and the blatant fabrication of early Christian texts. The entire issue revolves around one undeniable fact. These so-called independent accounts are anything but. Let's break it down. Priority. Who wrote first? If one text copies another, that means the original had to come first. Scholars overwhelmingly agree Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke shamelessly lifted massive portions from it. Over 90% of Mark's content appears in Matthew and over 50% in Luke, often word for word. This isn't inspiration, it's plagiarism disguised as revelation. Successive dependence, the copy-paste job. If these were truly independent accounts, why do Matthew and Luke frequently agree against Mark? This isn't some miraculous case of divine consistency. It's evidence of literary dependence. These weren't eyewitnesses recounting Jesus' life. They were scribes editing, tweaking, and revising someone else's work. The phantom sources, the Q hypothesis, and other lost texts. Matthew and Luke don't just copy Mark. They also share material not found in Mark, leading scholars to propose a hypothetical lost document, Q, from the German Quell, meaning source. But let's be real. Even if Q existed, it only further proves that these Gospels were cut-and-paste jobs, not independent testimonies. Oral tradition, a convenient excuse. Apologists love to claim these Gospels relied on oral tradition. But let's get serious. Oral transmission doesn't produce near-verbatim textual copying. The Gospels weren't compiled from eyewitnesses retelling their experiences. They were assembled from existing written sources, edited to push a theological agenda. Lost in translation, who really put these words in Jesus' mouth? Jesus, his disciples, and virtually everyone he spoke to spoke Aramaic. Yet the Gospels were written in Koine Greek. That means somewhere along the way, someone translated everything, adding, modifying, or completely fabricating entire statements. Who did this? When? Under whose authority? Nobody knows. And that should terrify anyone who claims the Bible is divinely inspired. Redaction. The Gospel authors were theological spin doctors. Why do Matthew, Mark, and Luke change details, expand certain stories, or flat out contradict each other? Because they weren't historians. They were propagandists shaping the Jesus narrative to fit their respective audiences. Matthew, writing for Jews, fabricates a genealogy to make Jesus fit Old Testament prophecy. Luke, appealing to Gentiles, smooths over Jewish concerns and makes Jesus more universal. Mark, the earliest, is raw and unpolished, until Matthew and Luke come along and fix it. Part 3. The verdict. The Gospels are anonymous, theologically driven fiction. So let's be clear, none of the Gospel authors were eyewitnesses. Mark was a Greek-speaking Christian in Rome. Matthew and Luke copied Mark and Q with an added theological spin. John was written by a Christian group, not a single person. And the kicker? The original manuscripts didn't even have names attached to them. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were assigned decades, if not centuries, later by church leaders desperate to give their religious propaganda an air of credibility. So when Christians claim that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, they are repeating a myth, a falsehood, designed to keep believers from asking questions. The real authors were anonymous theologians crafting religious fiction, not recording history. The synoptic problem isn't a problem. It's a smoking gun, proving the Gospels are edited, manipulated, and anything but trustworthy historical accounts. When you strip away the faith-based excuses, what remains is an ugly reality. The foundational documents of Christianity are patched-together frauds, written not by eyewitnesses, but by anonymous Greek-speaking authors crafting a theological myth. And if the foundation of Christianity is built on anonymous, contradictory, and fabricated accounts, what does that say about the religion as a whole?